Are you committing any of the 7 deadly sins of real estate investing? Find out in this week's episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. Hi, everyone. I am the founder of Lady Landlords, Becky Nova, and I am here with this week's episode of our podcast. I really want to make sure that you are running your landlording business just as that, as a business. And sometimes that means that we need to make sure that we are up to date on all of our laws and regulations that we have to be following. So today I want to talk about one of the most important ones that all of us, regardless of where you are in the country or what state you're in and your property's in, need to be following. And that is the Fair Housing Act. Now, for a little background on this, why is this important? Well, when we are landlords, to actually run our business, there are things that we need to follow. There are guidelines, state laws, regulations that all go and govern what we do as landlords. One of the reasons for that is because remember that our role as a landlord is to provide safe housing for another fellow human being. And we need to make sure that we are following through on what is required of us. And I get it. This can actually be kind of confusing, and there's a lot of different regulations, and I see it all the time in the Lady Landlords Facebook group asking questions about, well, is this something that we have to follow here? Or is this something that we have to follow in this location? And I want to make sure that we all know that the FHA, Fair Housing Act, applies to every single one of us here in the States. So let's talk about why this is even important for us. Well, the Fair Housing Act actually protects everyone in housing from discrimination. Now, one thing that is great about this that does not really get talked about too much when we talk about the Fair Housing Act is how that actually helps us also as landlords. The reason for that is because the Fair Housing Act is actually not just for tenants. That also protects us as a landlord. What I mean by that is when we are applying for loans, when we are working with realtors, trying to get our offers put in, any of those other service providers that we work with for financing, finding properties, the legalities of what we need to do to be able to purchase those properties is actually also protected under the Fair Housing Act. It's not just for tenants and tenant screening. So I think that's something that a lot of landlords just feel like it's something that we have to make sure that we are not discriminating towards those that are applying for housing with us. But this is actually something that can be helpful for us as well. So if you do feel that you're being discriminated against when you are obtaining a loan, through an appraisal, anything like that, do make sure to understand that the Fair Housing Act actually does protect us. Now, any of those service providers could actually be held under the same consequences that we as landlords are. That can actually include fines, jail time, ending up on a registry list, criminal charges, all of those different things that can happen to us as landlords can actually also happen to those service providers. So this is why it's important for us to know, not just as landlords that are screening our tenants, but also to make sure that we are not being discriminated against as well. Now, when it comes to those tenants, we really want to think about this in terms of best practices for tenant screening. Now, I do have some other episodes here on our podcast or our YouTube channel that does go through best practices for tenant screening, but I really want to make sure to just focus on the Fair Housing Act for today's conversation. The reason for that is I want to make sure that we know what those 7 protected classes are. Those 7 protected classes under the Fair Housing Act are 1, race, 2, color, 3, religion, 4, national origin, 5, gender, 6, familial status, and 7, disability. In all of those different categories, we have to make sure that we are not discriminating when we are going through our tenant screening. This can be really important because if a tenant does feel that they're discriminated against, that is something then that they could file against us, and we would have to answer to either those consequences. And once again, that can affect our landlording business on a whole. So do make sure that for your property, that those are things that you are taking into consideration, that our criteria for renting to people is very clear. You want to make sure that that is also standardized. That's the best way to make sure that you're avoiding discriminating, even by accident, within your tenant practices. When you have a rental criteria that is written out, that is documented, that we know then does not violate any of those protected classes in the Fair Housing Act, it will help you in case someone does feel that they were discriminated against, because you can show proof. You can show proof that it did not matter what race, religion, or familial status that person was, but every single person that you screened was held to that same written out and documented rental criteria. So if you have not done that, I do encourage you to sit down and focus on what criteria you're going to use across the board for all of your different tenants. Also, do remember though that there are exemptions to those that have to follow the Fair Housing Act. Once again, this is a federal law, so a federal act. So this is something that will cover regardless of what state you are in or regardless of what state your rental property is. Every single person within Lady Landlords has to make sure that we are not discriminating against those 7 protected classes. But there are a few exemptions that I want to make sure that you're aware of. One of those first exemptions where you do not have to follow the Fair Housing Act is if you are residing in one of your properties, making it an owner occupied property, and therefore you would have 4 or less units within that building. So, an example of that would be I own a duplex. I actually do own a duplex. I own a few duplexes, but one of my duplexes I actually live in. That therefore makes it an owner occupied property and it therefore has less than 4 units. So I do not have to follow the fair housing guidelines because of that. This could also be in a situation where you are looking to rent out rooms and you're going to have somebody else in your room. In that situation, you absolutely can say, I prefer another woman. I prefer somebody of this age. All of those different things that you can do if it is that owner occupied property and 4 or less units. Another exemption to the Fair Housing Act is if you have a single family property that will be rented by you, the owner, meaning that you are not putting on the MLS, you're not going through a realtor or another professional, but you yourself are renting out that single family home. In that situation, you are also exempt from the Fair Housing Act. Another situation, which might not apply to too many people listening to this podcast, but if you have housing that is either managed by a private club or a religious organization that only rents property to those members within those organizations, they also do not have to follow the Fair Housing Act. Lastly, another important exemption to make sure that you know about is if there is in any way a direct threat that can occur from that person moving in. So they actually label that in the Fair Housing Act as the exemption of if there is the propensity of violence or if that person is a known drug user. In those situations as well, you can also decline a tenant and not be in violation of the Fair Housing Act. So all of these different regulations are things that we as landlords need to make sure that we are aware of and that we are also following. It is one of the reasons, as many of you know from the Lady Landlords Facebook group, that I do share it is important to make sure to know what legislation is being passed in your area or where your rental property is. You want to make sure that you are attending meetings or are up to date on what is happening within your city or town councils. It is important to know what is happening in the quality of life within the neighborhoods where our properties are. This is a great way for us to be able to protect our investments and also to be running our businesses as landlords to really the best way that we possibly can. So do make sure to read up on your Fair Housing Act. That is something that we need to all make sure that as a benchmark baseline that we are all starting there following that. So make sure to go back and remember what those 7 classes are within the Fair Housing Act. If you need other help or are looking to make sure to learn a little bit more about what you can and cannot say to make sure that you are not in violation of the Fair Housing Act, please feel free to join our tenant management certification course. Here within the certification course with Lady Landlords, we go through all of those different regulations that you need to make sure that you're following to ensure that you are not in violation of any of the guidelines that you need to be following as a lady landlord. I'll make sure to put the link down in the show notes if you're interested in joining us for that course. Also, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or if you're watching us on YouTube, to not miss out on the next episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. We release new episodes every single Tuesday. Thanks so much, and see you back in the Lady Landlords Facebook group.